this observation would be, listening and watching Sheku, is what exactly is the problem? In one sense, because clearly the problem doesn't lie in the area of talent or in the area of commitment in a very competitive artistic field and so on and so forth. So I think to start with, we have to raise the issue of the problem out of, if you like, the motivation or whatever it might be, or whatever we might think about black and minority ethnic communities, as much as we have done in the field of education of young black people. We raised it out of saying they were the problem and look at the structures around as to where those problems lies. Because I don't believe it lies in whether or not people want to do this kind of work, young people, or want to follow this as a profession. The problem lies somewhere else. So let's start by not problematizing the subject of our discussion. That's the first thing. The other thing is observations to say, if you look at diversity across the arts in general, I think it's a mixed picture. Because on the one hand, there are, at the moment, lots of people from, for example, black and minority ethnic backgrounds or disabled young people who are coming in through the bottom of the arts. So, if you like, the motivation is definitely there. They are coming through. But if you look at the figures across the arts, what you find the problem is they tend to stay at a certain level. I generalise, of course, because there are individuals who manage to kind of break through those glass ceilings, but in general, they stay at a particular level. And I think that's part of the problem that we face, is actually there's not enough of there's not enough people, as it were, throughout the tiers of the British arts world. And remember, the British arts world is a very, very hierarchical system traditionally. And that is a problem in terms of, if you like, how power and decisions are shared or throughout the arts. So that's the first thing. But the other thing that I think is useful to note is that this conversation, it's great it's happening here, is not exclusive just to classical music. For example, if you looked in The Guardian last week, there was an article and a debate started up around the presence of black ballet dancers in our major ballet troupes, and the fact that very similar conversation going on around ballet. Now that was quite interesting because on one hand, what was quite clear was there were by the ballet training schools and so on and so forth, there was a thrust to try and get more people, more diverse intake into ballet, into training. But that intake wasn't appearing on the stage when it actually came to performances from our big ballet organisations who do take a large amount of state funding. And for me, yes, it is a question of representation. It is a question of getting people interested and getting people engaged in these artistic enterprises, whatever it might be. But also, it seems to me, there is an underlying problem, which is the question of aesthetics. See, in ballet, one of the things that came through as this article was that the black presence on the ballet stage was somehow problematic in terms of how ballet, the traditions of ballet. And therefore, in one sense, although you can train people up, if there's a problem, actually there's an aesthetic barrier actually to people being recruited into the large ballet companies. If there's something in terms of the traditions of those ballet companies, how they see ballet in the 21st century, then it's not just a question of representation. Actually, there are deeper questions which I think go to the heart of the art form, how the art forms develop, and whether actually the art forms are prepared to take on different influences to be able to innovate them. And when I talk about innovation, I think it's not the problem. It seems to me is not, if we talk about the periphery and the mainstream, as Kwame talked about, it's not so much a question of can we somehow get a few people into the mainstream without the mainstream changing. I think the mainstream has to change itself somehow. It has to devolve power somehow. It has to devolve power over artistic decision making. It has to be not afraid of innovation. And for me, who work in the Arts Council, we are interested in innovation, not in the sense of just for the sake of it, because we believe that actually art forms to grow and to thrive always have to push themselves forward somehow. And if they don't let in new influences, then they begin to ossify, and to be honest, they become heritage and not a living art form. So innovation is very, very important. And this brings me to the final thing I want to say, which is, what are the themes and problems that arise when attempting to change the status quo? Because I think in one sense this is partly what this conversation is about. It's not just about trying to force a few people in, but it's also trying to change the nature of the art form as well at the same time. And it seems to me there are a number of things. One thing, I think, I probably speak from everyone in this room, is that the pace of change is still too slow. It's too incremental, it's too evolutionary, and in British society, British society likes to think of itself as going through a kind of incremental evolutionary process. But to be honest, the rate of change is so small that we won't get to a place where we want to be unless actually something begins to speed up. Someone takes some initiative somewhere along the line, someone who's in charge of the different pieces of the jigsaw takes some initiative somewhere along the line and push things forward. So there's a pace of change. Secondly, is the nature of the change. And I think this is important as well. I think, somehow, actually, the people who are the subject of this discussion today, in other words, the black and minority ethnic communities who wish to engage in the arts, somehow they have to take some kind of control over the nature of change as well. Because the big institutions, and I work in a big institution, it can kind of allow a few people in, but the challenge for big institutions is actually the nature of the change as well. In other words, they don't like to be confronted, but sometimes I think you do have to confront institutions for them to change. It can't just be on their terms all the time. You actually have to put forward a programme which actually says, we at least want to meet you halfway in terms of the nature of the change. So I think the nature of the change is important, maybe something to think about. I think another thing to think about when you're talking about attempting to change the status quo is the nature of the partnerships driving change. And here I think there is a fundamental question of power, as I talked about before, and a question of democracy. In one sense, it seems to me large institutions can relate to smaller bodies, but they like to do it on their own terms. In actual fact, I think those smaller bodies have to say, well, actually, we want some kind of more equal partnership, really, where actually power is devolved somehow to us, to enable us to begin to articulate exactly what it is that we need. In other words, in one sense, yes, a big institution, a big arts organisation could work with a small institution or group of individuals, but unless there's a change in the balance of power, the kind of institutions kind of get the benefit and the small organisations tend not to. They kind of, they kind of, it's an unsatisfactory relationship. And the two things I want to end on is one, that I think if you look at the statistics, we have to do something about the closed networks in the arts world. 8 out of 10 jobs in the arts world are secured by closed networks. In other words, it's whom you know as opposed to the talent that you may well have. 8 out of 10, which is an astounding figure, and that's a figure from a very repeatable report. So, in one sense, you can have an outward sense of equality of opportunity, but if the networks are closed at the end of the day, you're not going to get very far. So we have to do something about those closed networks, and I mean the Arts Council as much as anyone else. And the last thing I want to end on is this, is that I think what I've noticed, I've been in the arts for 30 years, is there's an over-professionalisation of the arts, by which there's only one route to be able to get into the arts these days. When I started out in theatre, we used to get actors from everywhere, whatever it was, if they were raw talent, didn't really matter. And then we, as part of a professional theatre company, we train them up as part of being on the job, as it were. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily satisfactory or doesn't have its problems. But if, for example, theatre companies only recruit from RADA or LAMDA or whatever it might be, actually what are they doing? Actually, they're taking a very small group of people in society who can get into those kind of those training institutions, who can afford to get into those training institutions, which we know is a growing problem. But at the same time, what they're doing is they're leaving out all that talent which is out there, which can't fund itself through those institutions. So I believe, and I'll finish on this because I'm getting a glance, is actually, I think there is a problem with the arts training. It's becoming very narrow, and therefore it's becoming very elitist, and that is a big barrier, I think, to opening up the arts.
Thank you, Hassan.